Thanks, everybody. Over the last couple of years, there has been a lot of convergence around the topic of equity and social emotional learning. At our investee organizations, this topic has directly or indirectly come up as each organization has begun to undertake or deepen their social emotional learning work. We've also had many conversations with our colleagues at Harvard and the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence about this, as it relates to our work as a foundation, what we do and how we do it. At the national stage, equity in general has become part of our country's conversation. Equity and social emotional learning is part of that, including at the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. And as many of you have seen recently in an EdWeek article featuring one of our distinguished panelists today, even at the funder level, these conversations are happening. And these conversations are happening because we know that we can't achieve successful education and life outcomes for everyone without tackling the equity gap in our country today. We can't achieve academic outcomes without developing and supporting the whole child. And we can't do either of these unless our approaches to social emotional learning have equity as its foundation. To quote teacher Africa Full Love from the Sacramento City Unified School District, equity and SEL are the way to create the learning conditions for all children to be successful. So this is all that has inspired the topic for our panel discussion today. Before I hand it over to our panel, at your seats, you will find 2 books for you to take home, which we hope you find useful and relevant to today's conversation. One is Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond, geared toward educators on why culturally responsive teaching is important for student learning, as well as ideas for how to become a more culturally responsive educator. The other is a children's book with either a social and emotional learning, diversity, or equity theme. We encourage you to read and enjoy this children's book and then pass it on to a special child in your life, or feel free to donate it to a local library or school. A full list of these children's books, which have been vetted by experts in these fields, can be found in your folder at your seat. Each investee has received a full set of these books for their school library. Also after the panel, we will have a short break where everyone is encouraged to grab some food and reconvene for some wonderful table discussions. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our incredible panel moderator, Dr. Gretchen Brion-Meisels, who will take it from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think this is my 4th convening, so I wasn't at the first one, sadly. I am not much for podiums, but I want to be able to see these slides. So I'm going to stand over here for a little while, and then I will sit down when we start to have our panelists talk, which will be the exciting part of this evening. I was tasked with just giving a little bit of a framing on thinking about equity and social emotional learning, and how you might consider the relationship between those things. And so that's what I'm going to do very briefly right now, and then I'm going to hand it over to the panelists and I'll explain how that's going to work. So we know about SEL. I'm not going to go over this again because I'm preaching to the choir here. And we know that there are lots of elements of social emotional learning that matter, as Morales referenced, for academic development, as well as for other positive outcomes around relationships, health, and well-being in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So the question for today is, what is equity, and how does that relate to what we know and what we're asking about social emotional learning? There are a lot of ways to talk about equity work, and I have chosen one that's very simple and for which there is a visual metaphor that I find helpful. And so I'm going to share this one with you, not because I think it's the best, but because I think it's helpful in terms of wrapping our head around the challenges that we're going to be talking about today. So this is a visual that helps us think about the difference between equality, equity, and liberation. And actually, folks have been adding to this visual over the last 5 years, so I've seen one for inclusion and other things. When we talk about equality, we are often talking about giving everyone the same, right? So we're talking about everyone having equal access to the same set of stuff in order to participate in school in the context that we're talking about. When we talk about equity, we are typically talking about giving everyone what they need so that they can access the same materials. So the difference there is that some folks may need a slightly higher podium or slightly different resources than other folks in order to access the same everyday material of school, right? When we talk about liberation, we are talking about what it means to remove the barriers to access that exist in the fundamental structures in which we live, including the fundamental structures of school, such that full inclusion is really possible, right? So I start with this because I think it's helpful to think about in our own work, when are we talking about equality, when are we talking about equity, and when are we talking about what these folks are talking about as liberation, but as actually addressing structural inequality in the systems that exist around children and youth today, such that we are removing barriers to opportunity. So just like there's lots of ways to talk about equity work, there are lots of ways to talk about, or several ways to talk about the relationship between equity and social emotional learning. Many folks start this conversation by talking from the perspective of brain science. And if we talk from the perspective of brain science, we know that equity and social emotional learning are closely linked because of ways in which environmental stress and trauma affect brain development. So we know that persistent high levels of stress in one's environment make it more challenging for anyone, including children and young people, to practice using the parts of our brain that control executive functioning, which we sometimes talk about as the control center with kids. And we know that the more stress that we face and the more opportunities, the more common it is for us to have to react to stressful experiences through our stress response system, the harder it is to access that part of the brain. So we know that persistent high levels of stress in one's environment make it challenging to develop and practice executive functioning skills and also to use them even once you have them. And we also know that executive functioning skills are fundamental to the way that we define, describe, and talk about success in school. So if you don't have them, it's very hard to be successful in school. If you're struggling to utilize them, it's very hard to be successful in school. So in that sense, we can think about SEL as promoting equity because it supports children who are facing high levels of stress to get access to practicing and developing their executive functioning skills. And one way to think about SEL is fundamentally motivated by questions about equity is that it's trying to equalize the opportunity to access these skills and to practice using these skills. But I would argue that simply providing high quality social emotional learning work is not enough because it runs the risk of sitting back here in the equality or probably more equity buckets. And what I mean by that is that if we want SEL to promote equity or liberation in a deeper, more liberatory sense, we need to think not only about giving young people access to social emotional skills and executive functioning skills, but also about what our fundamental understandings about human development and social emotional learning mean for the work of schools. So in other words, what can SEL teach us about the ways that schools and adults need to shift and change in order to remove the everyday barriers to access that marginalized children and youth often face in the schools that they attend? Telling young folks in the face of structural racism or xenophobia that we are going to give them skills to better help them cope and remain calm in the face of that structural inequality is not enough. And some, like me, might argue it's actually harmful, right? Instead, we need to partner with youth to begin to build a toolbox of the kinds of skills that both adults and young people need to be able to remove obstacles to the barriers to equity that exist. So we need to learn to use SEL for the purpose of liberation. And today, we are very lucky in that we are going to hear from folks who are experts in thinking about the difficulty of doing this work and who have thought deeply about what it means to do SEL work that actually furthers equity. So we're going to ask ourselves, as Dr. Jagers might say, how can we be sure that our SEL work acts as resistance to oppression that is transformational? How can we be sure that the work we are doing honors the young folks and families with whom we work as experts in their own experience and works to remove barriers to equity? With that, and so there's a lot of questions that come up in this realm because there are many ways in which how we think about the purpose of SEL can really shape the work that we're doing. So questions might be things like, why does SEL often look different in low-income areas and high-income areas? Or whose safety are we protecting, when, and how? Or whose values and styles of communication and behavior are we prioritizing? What are we doing for children who need to learn to code switch in order to be successful across contexts? Or how can schools account for harm that's occurring outside of the building in more structural socio-political realms as they think about the SEL work they're doing in schools? Okay, enough from me. So I have the honor of introducing our panel tonight. We have asked each member of the panel to speak about a slightly different element of the work that they are doing around equity and SEL so that you get a sense of what this looks like and sounds like and what struggles exist as you try to think about SEL and equity across different ecological contexts or domains. I think what I'm going to do is to introduce everyone, and then I will turn it over to them, and they will each give a 5-minute presentation about their work, and then we will open it up to questions. I may ask a question or two, but hopefully you will ask the questions, and that we'll take it from there. So I'm going to start with Dr. Dina Simmons. Dr. Dina Simmons is the Director of Education at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. She received her BA from Middlebury College, her MSED from Pace University, and her MA and EDD from Columbia University Teachers College. She oversees training, coaching, and education initiatives at the center. Prior to her work at the center, she served as an educator, teacher, educator, diversity trainer, and curriculum developer. Dina's primary research interests focus on assessing teacher preparedness to address bullying in the K-12 school setting. But she brings with her a wealth of knowledge around teacher education, pedagogy, and questions of equity, inclusion, and anti-oppression work. Much of the stuff that she's written includes work on teacher education, social justice pedagogy, education reform, and bullying. So we are very excited to have her here today. Next in line, we have Dr. Colin Rose. Colin Rose is the Assistant Superintendent of Opportunity and Achievement Gaps for the Boston Public Schools. His work is focused on eliminating structural barriers and promoting culturally affirming practices for student populations that have been marginalized in order to foster the conditions needed for student achievement. Prior to coming to BPS, Dr. Rose spent 10 years as an educator. Prior to coming to BPS as Assistant Superintendent, Dr. Rose spent 10 years as an educator in Roxbury. He was also a member of the Male Educators of Color Executive Coaching Seminar. Beyond the Boston Public Schools, Dr. Rose has worked as a consultant for the University of Pittsburgh's Institute for Learning and as a lecturer for the University of Massachusetts of Boston in the Graduate School of Education. Third in our panel is Huron Russell, who is a music teacher at the Conley Elementary School, which is a school in Boston that serves students in pre-K through 5th grade. In collaboration with Priscilla Valentine, who is sitting next to her, Huron strives to teach music in context, utilizing musical explorations to learn deeply about young people, our community, their communities, and the world. Huron grew up in Vermont, but is proud to call Boston home. We've got a Vermont theme, Middlebury, Vermont. Priscilla Valentine is a bilingual educator who's been teaching in the Boston Public School System for over 15 years. Her family originally immigrated from Colombia, South America. As a literacy enrichment specialist, Priscilla teaches about social justice through reading, writing, and arts integration. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Rob Jagers is a developmental psychologist who investigates the complex connections among culture, race, and class and their impact on the social emotional development of urban youth. He studies how culture influences and is influenced by African American youth and their functioning in the different contexts in which they must negotiate. His work is important for the design of interventions designed to limit risky behaviors and support positive youth development. And on a personal note, he has provided me with a lot of the language to talk about the tension that we are going to be discussing today. So I am very excited to have this panel, to be able to learn from this panel with you. Our plan is that we are going to start by having Dina talk a little bit about settings that promote SEL and equity. And then maybe when you're done with that, I'll just stand up and prompt Colin so that we can keep things going. And then we'll do questions at the end. Okay, go ahead.
Could you go back to the image equity? I just want to say something about that image, which is that the equity piece, it actually doesn't reflect reality, which is people don't start at the same playing field. So it's even, and usually the reality is that the playing field is higher for the most marginalized, and so is the fence. So that I just wanted to put that out there as a reflection of reality. But so I'm going to speak a little bit about, I don't want to take SEL out of context. I want to talk about education in general in schools and equity. And so when we think about equity and SEL, I think it's important to consider the barriers that exist, some of which Gretchen mentioned. But one barrier, I would need 6 barriers not to be so overwhelming, but one would be educator stress and burnout. I think educator stress and burnout is a barrier to optimal learning in an optimal learning environment. We know that our educators co-create the emotional climate in the school. They help facilitate safe learning and model the skills that we hope to see in our students. So if we have stressed and burnout teaching force, and we're not giving and showing our students the skills we want them to see. Another thing also that I think is a barrier is discriminatory disciplinary practices. So when we think about the school to prison pipeline and we think of who is in that pipeline, we're looking at mostly students of Black and brown boys mostly. And when students are excluded from schools, I think we're now talking about going from 194 or 92 suspensions to 2. We're basically sending them these messages that she shared, but we're also excluding students from the opportunities to develop their social, emotional, and academic skills, and to engage in interpersonal relationship building and so on. And they are not having the opportunity to have school connectedness, which supports students in being connected to the school. I also think we have to talk about inadequate and inequitable funding. So obviously, a school district that has the funds to have SEL programs, it's not all about SEL programming, but to have teacher training, to engage in teacher recruitment, teacher retention, those are going to be some issues. We also know that in schools with lower resources, they tend to have more problems in implementing anything at all, any sort of programming. And we have to talk about poverty and unaddressed trauma and how it impacts executive functioning and brain development, and how it limits students' future outcomes. And I also have to say that we have to talk about the teacher-student cultural mismatch. I think, we could, and unconscious bias, implicit bias, and how that contributes to low expectations and discriminatory disciplinary practices and school connectedness for the most marginalized group of students. So if we are thinking of creating opportunities or ways to mitigate those barriers, I think we have to focus on ensuring that educators are supported, so that they're supported in their SEL development and in well-being. Because when they are supported and they have greater well-being, students do better. And they're able to cope better, they're able to teach SEL skills to students and promote overall well-being, not only for themselves, but also for the school community. I think also as we think about addressing the discriminatory discipline practices, we have to think about how we can incorporate restorative practices in school discipline that are rooted in SEL. So, and though the research on that is anecdotal for now, we do know that it does shift mindsets. And those mindsets are extremely important and can help mitigate the school to prison pipeline, which we know for Black boys starts as early as pre-K. So as soon as a Black kid walks into a school of color, they are criminalized. So we need to begin to shift those mindsets so that we find ways to support students in developing the skills necessary to be successful. I would also talk about school finance reform. We've seen it happen in a number of states, but school finance reform that hopefully sort of levels up the playing field, although that in capitalistic society is not possible, but we can dream, right? We can dream, right? Well, it could allow for adequate funding and high quality teacher instruction, more adequate distribution of funds. I also think we have to think about trauma-informed systems, trauma-informed approaches, so that our students get the support that they need in order to be successful. That all students come to school at the same place, and so we have to meet our students where they are. And another important piece is that we have to recruit and retain our teachers of color. Because teachers of color are not only good for students of color, they're good for all students. All students benefit from teachers of color. And so when students have, there is the potential with teachers of color to ensure better education and life outcomes for all students. And so I think if we think about SEL equity, we have to think largely about the structural inequities, but also the discriminatory practices that continue to perpetuate the problematic status quo. And I think when we think about SEL and equity, that it's important to think that SEL is not done to people. SEL is a process. And when we talk about SEL, particularly when we talk about SEL and Black and brown kids, it is done to them. It is to help them learn to save them from themselves. And I think we have to be very, very careful about how we talk about SEL when we're talking about Black and brown kids. And as someone who is a kid from the Bronx, whose narrative was told for me often, I think it's very careful that we are very, very mindful about how we tell stories, because oftentimes we dehumanize people. And I think it's important for us to, as we think about SEL, as we think about equity, to bring humanity back into the work that we do in education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. So I'm going to move back over and wonder if you, Dr. Rose, want to talk a little bit about what equity and SEL can look like from a district perspective.
Yeah, so good evening. So a lot of the things that Dina just talked about, I actually, is part of my job. I work in kind of three buckets in our system. I have some programmatic pieces, a lot of capacity building, and then also some systematic pieces. So I have a policy, the Opportunity Should Be Gap policy, that was passed by school committee. It was NAACP, myself, parent groups, advocates, teachers, students. It's a logic model for how you close opportunity gaps in Boston. And a lot of the things that Dina talked about around funding, the racial makeup of our teachers in the district, and pedagogy are part of that. And I get to work with every office in DPS and building and pushing issues of equity across the district. One thing I'll focus on, though, is around our capacity building mechanisms in our office. One of the goals for the last 10 years in Boston to close opportunity gaps and achievement gaps in the logic model is cultural proficiency. When I came into my position about 2 years ago, I sat down at a table and said, what is cultural proficiency? And nobody could define it. We weren't measuring it. And we were not pushing it out in a systematic manner in the district. So one of the first goals I had was we need to define what cultural proficiency means to me, which means equity work in the classroom and also at the school level. So we created out of my office a set of competencies that we call cultural and linguistically sustaining practices that should be the expectations for all people in Boston Public Schools, all staff members. I don't care if you're a school committee member. I don't care if you are a janitor at the school. And really those three competencies start with awareness. Awareness of the socio-political paradigm that is our country, and locally that is our city. Our own biases and where they come from. What are our cultural norms? And how do we filter the world? And how does that interact with our social political context? From that understanding and awareness, how do you then, second competency, create authentic relationships with your students, your families, the communities that we serve, right? Not from a deficit frame or from my personal frame, but from a waste that, from a level of stepping back and understanding the paradigms that we are filtering our students through, right? And especially our marginalized populations. So that then we can change our practices to match the aspirations and the needs of our population and not fit them into a box. How that interfaces with social emotional learning, I think it's impossible to do social emotional learning without that awareness piece to begin with, and do it effectively, and do it in a way that is not weaponized against our marginalized populations. If we do not do that, we will then pull SEL through the deficit paradigm that we pull everything else through. So what we're really talking about is changing the paradigm and how we look at our communities, how we look at our students, and in some ways what skills are necessary for students, especially those that are marginalized, to be successful in our schools and successful in society, and be part of the cycle of equity in our society in general. One thing that we talk about is the ability of our staff to talk about racism, to talk about culture, and their intersectionality with those two. And it is a strategy so that we can better engage our students and respect where their families come from and where they come from. But it's also in hopes that down the line we have a true teaching staff that can facilitate conversations around consciousness. If not in school, I don't know where. But I think a lot of the things that we see in society, if we want to continue to have a true democratic pluralistic society, our students need to understand these paradigms and be part of the change. And I don't care if they're white, black, brown, Asian, doesn't matter. If not everybody is part of that conversation, then we continue the status quo and the same people. To me, this is an opportunity gap. The same people that are marginalized today will be marginalized tomorrow. And so CLSP is our way to operationalize cultural proficiency. We set out a course to make sure that it's part of all the structures in our district. It's in its infancy right now. Just talking to my colleagues, two extremely well-versed teachers in Boston Public Schools about how the work is starting at their school, a school that really didn't touch the equity conversation before, and how it's being operationalized there. But we worked with all principals across the district. Last year, my team, we dove into the topics of awareness. We talked about the paradigm of race. We talked about white privilege, what internalized racism looks like and how we support it as a school district, intersectionality, and then we really had labs with our school leaders around how do you bring this type of awareness to your schools and your classrooms in an authentic way that's embedded in your instructional focus and the work that you're already doing in your schools through real life issues that are going on in your school, whether it's disproportional discipline or just your achievement gaps. We're doing the same thing for cabinet right now, a series of monthly, half-day equity trainings. We've introduced the racial equity tools district-wide so that when people are thinking of policy and programming, they're starting to bring an equity lens at the beginning instead of trying to cover their tracks at the end and reporting out why it's good for students, especially those that are marginalized. So that's just a small piece of the work that we do, but that's our kind of intersection with SEL. We do have a social emotional learning office in Boston Public Schools. I sit on an instructional roundtable with academics, the social emotional learning office, the office of English language learners and special education, where we kind of all bring our frameworks together to try to push down a frame to our school and our teachers in a digestible way that incorporate all of our lenses so that they don't have to digest it on their own. We call that the Essentials for Instructional Equity. It's in its infancy. We talked about some of the coursework that some of our teachers took this summer, but that will continue to grow. But again, SEL without equity, we're going to perpetuate the same deficit paradigms and really weaponize SEL, and I've seen it in buildings already as I walk across Boston.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Haran and Priscilla, do you want to talk a little bit about how you think about equity and SEL at the classroom level?
Absolutely. Good evening, and thank you to Dr. Simmons and Dr. Rose. So we come from a very small traditional style school in Boston, the Conley School in Rosendale. We've both been there less than 5 years. We've been doing work around equity and race prior. So coming into this building, there's really never been real conversations around SEL and race, which in our building are very much, and I believe very much intertwined. The majority of the children, our population, are Black and Latino, and the majority of the teachers are white. We began our inclusion about 4 years ago, so starting in kindergarten, so now it's up to grade level 3. And it has significantly shifted the culture in the school. Children, we look really great on paper. We're a level 1 school, which, we have really great test scores, and when you walk through the halls or when you walk into classrooms, it looks very different. There are children throughout the building in crisis. There are children who are not able to self-regulate, children who very much need SEL. And we have teachers who don't know or don't have the skills or frankly really don't think that it's a priority. So our work has been trying to bring this awareness into the building. Because we're a level 1 school, teachers are very much for teaching to the standards and not much else. And we're seeing it just explode out of the building now because of the children being in crisis and teachers not making or building relationships with students and with families. We see a lack of just traditional meeting spaces, like morning meeting happening in the building. And so we went to, thanks to the work that Dr. Rose's office does, we went to our principal after we applied and received a grant, and we talked to him about bringing in some work. And he said, as a matter of fact, I'm doing this work on my level, at the district level, and we have this CLSP school plan that I need to complete. Will you help me? And that is kind of how we ended up beginning the work. So we're just beginning the work. Our administrator does see that there's a need for it. He's getting the push from a district level. So we're just now starting. We started a race dialogue PD, which didn't go very well with the staff, but we're sort of moving forward with the grant that we received, and Ms. Russell can talk a little bit about what it's going to look like moving forward.
Yeah, so I think part of this piece of being a level 1 school and being really successful on the tests is that for years we've been successful by asking our students to check who they are at the door. And so their identities, their experiences, and their emotions are really not welcome. We're a school that has SEL, but it comes out of a box, and so it really is precisely this weaponized use of SEL. It's a way of supporting students to check their emotions at the door, to say, you're upset, how are you going to fix that so you can get this math lesson? Meanwhile, we have a community of teachers who really have a discomfort, a lack of experience, and a lack of ability talking about race. We're majority white teachers. And we often hear from them that either they don't know how to have this conversation or that it's inappropriate. But these are our students' lived experiences. And so to have your teacher not acknowledging who you are, what kind of stress does that cause? So how are we going to teach students to deal with that stress when we're inflicting that stress? So the idea, the project that we're working on is to create what we're calling a culturally responsive morning meeting. And so we want to shift from this curricular approach to SEL to an approach that really focuses on community building relationships between students and teachers, acknowledging and celebrating who we are and getting to know one another, and building a classroom community that is safe and welcoming and that's able to deal with difficult things. Recognizing the challenges that teachers feel like they have in having difficult conversations and in sort of moving out of the test prep paradigm and into a people paradigm, we want to create a structure that can ritualize some of these practices. So we know that every day we're going to sit together for 15 or 20 minutes and we'll have our greeting and we'll have an opportunity to share. And we'll build community through that, and we'll have rituals that we can fall back on when hard things happen, whether those hard things are student conflict and things happening in the building or things happening in the world. We feel that safe, held space is really important. And we're hopeful that this structure can really be sort of a seed. So it's 15 or 20 minutes a day, but it's not, but it filters up throughout the day. It's the way that we create our community. It's the way that we start to learn to interact with one another. And it's building those social and emotional skills and inviting who we are. So we're hopeful that by taking time in the day, it will start to impact who we are as classrooms and as a school.
Thank you so much, Ms. Russell and Ms. Valentine. Dr. Jagers, do you want to talk a little bit, take us home by talking a little bit about SEL in the community?
So, first of all, thank you all very much for having me, for the invitation to just provide an excellent opportunity to reconnect with some people who are overdue to reconnect with, as well as to meet new folks who are very much interested in this kind of work. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the issues, and it's always nice to be at the end of the table with very bright and committed people, because it makes your job easier. A lot of things that are very near and dear to the types of things we're trying to engage in have been raised, and so it provides a nice platform. So I want to make a couple of comments in two buckets. Right? So first, I would want to acknowledge my ongoing relationship with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. I have had the opportunity to know Dr. Weisberg for quite a bit of time. And historically, our conversation has been around SEL, necessary but not sufficient because of the inherent inequities in society. And I'm not going to beat that horse because it's already been raised here, but all of the things that I have tried to do both in school and out of school time are informed by that fundamental understanding that the society that we live in is race, is gender, is ethnic, it's class, etc. And one cannot ignore those realities when you talk in terms of self-awareness, when you talk in terms of social awareness and the like. And to the point of colleagues, it does then require them to check who they are at the door, but it also requires teachers in many respects to check who they are at the door as well. Because one of the things you've heard across these presentations is the importance of adult social and emotional learning, and not social and emotional learning in a decontextualized, depoliticized fashion, but one that digs into issues of race, class, gender, and the like, so that we can in fact construct the type of society that I think many of us are looking towards. With regard to, and I could talk to you about the number of initiatives that we're involved in, to include a revision of, or attempted revision of CASEL 5 competencies that in many respects align with what my colleague Colin was describing. So he and I need to compare some notes that then provides a launch point to begin talking about other types of tools that one can utilize, school guides, et cetera, et cetera. The CASEL program reviews that CASEL has become renowned for does very well, but issues of equity are not included in that work. And so my strengthening relationship with them, I'm now a senior research fellow, is intended to help push that work forward. Many of the things, so to switch gears for a minute, around our school time program, many of the things that I've been involved in our school time space have in fact had SEL woven through them. I just didn't necessarily know that that's what it was we were doing. More recently, however, one of the reasons why out of school time space has become so important is because I now am the director of a program called Wolverine Pathway, which is the University of Michigan's Diversity Pipeline program. We have about 700 young people who we work with in out of school time space on Saturdays and during the academic year. So 8 Saturdays in the fall, 8 Saturdays in winter, and then in the summer we have them for 5 weeks during the week, because folks are freed up as well as school space. So we push that program out into school communities. So we rent space in 3 school communities. If you're familiar with Ann Arbor and surrounding areas, so we're Ypsilanti, Southfield, and Detroit as school communities that we work in. Young people can enter the program either in grade 7 or grade 10. And once they enter the program, they stay with us. It's a cohort sequential process. And so to this point, we'll be 3 years old in February. We have accumulated 700 students and anticipate a max of 1,200. The intention, the university's intention is to have something that is intentional, focused, and accountable around college-going preparation, bringing more young people from under-resourced communities where the university has not realized its yield, or maximally realized its yield, i.e. there are young people who have unrealized potential or have substantial potential that would allow them to come to the University of Michigan, but many of them have decided not to. And so as part of the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion platform, this program, Delivering Pathways, was developed. Many of the limitations that my colleagues spoke about don't necessarily exist in the out-of-school time space, especially in the out-of-school time place that we control and we're building and developing. We work very hard on adult SEL. We have a core staff, but also hire certified classroom teachers in order to deliver the curriculum. And we PD them on the types of things we've been discussing here. We benefit certainly by the fact that we have an admissions process. So young people have to have a substantial grade point average. They have to apply. They're vetted, not unlike the University of Michigan undergraduate program. So the young people and the families are already leaning in to an academic enrichment experience provided by the University of Michigan. However, the teachers would say, why isn't school like this? This helped me to continue teaching because we treat them, our underlying philosophy is participatory democracy. It was alluded to earlier. In our school time space, we have less concern about hierarchical relation and more concern about voice, choice, and participation. So we treat teachers as colleagues, as partners, as co-constructors of curriculum. So all the curriculum that our team developed go out 2 weeks early in anticipation PD. Teachers mark it up, they come in, we talk about the strengths and challenges, we modify it, we do the actual modifications and send it back to them in anticipation of the launch of the program. So they feel more included. We debrief with them after every Saturday session. And we talk about the curriculum and how we've supported them with our infrastructure or not. We take that constructive criticism and we try to make it better. Our young people experience the academic programming in the same way. We run two project-based learning modules per session. Project-based learning is inquiry-based, youth-driven, requires delving into the big issues that the university takes up: sustainability, climate change, health inequities. It allows us to leverage the university's ranking and the scholarship knowledge is generated in that context and push that down to ask those young people then to take up those questions because they are the next generation of informed and engaged citizens. And they need to understand knowledge construction and critical consumption of knowledge in areas that are important to their lived experience, but also to your lived experience. They're the next generation, and as we age out, they will be assuming our positions. And so it is short-sighted to unrealize all the potential that these young people have. So we use project-based learning as a way for them to hone their own learning. We help them take the big question and then understand the implications for their own context. Thereby you get increased engagement, you get opportunities for them to demonstrate the knowledge that they have acquired back to the school community. Each session has a demonstration day where the young people teach the adults in the community about what they learned. We have attendance requirements, of course, both for the young people as well as for the parents, and so we have high parent involvement. And again, in our school time space, you can do things like that, especially when young people who complete our program successfully apply to the University of Michigan and get in will get a full tuition scholarship. So we have built-in incentives for young people who are leaning into education. And of course, the critical analysis, the social emotional learning that we talked about here is woven throughout what it is we're doing. And so there's a lot of group-based work, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of peer mentoring and feedback and deep conversation both among the students, but the students also talk to their parents about these issues. And so we have parents asking to sit in on sessions, emailing us about, well, what is it that you're talking about with regard to water? Water is a resource. Where does our water come from? Our young person came home asking me those questions. What are the answers? And so, in many respects, we have liberated ourselves, right? And go back to the initial slide. We have tried to liberate ourselves from the impediments, the structures that prevent us from optimizing educational experiences for young people. Hopefully, these kinds of innovations, they sound like they're happening in schools that you all have described. And we would encourage, we have tried to build a portable program. We're also very concerned about the alignment between out of school time and school, because there's, in the literature, there's this notion of constrained democracy. And constrained democracy came up in the context of young people experiencing youth participatory action research, project-based learning, then having to go back into school and interact with teachers who had a more hierarchical way of interacting with them. Subsequently, those bright, engaged young people become discipline problems because they know how to effectively challenge authority. Adult SEL is pivotal to what it is we want to achieve. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yeager.
So I'm going to close this up. So I'm the closer, y'all. So I think as we think about SEL, we have to consider the reframing of SEL, the narrative around SEL. And so basically, I'm just going to try to sum up what I've heard on the panel, which is that SEL needs to be integrated into the fabric of how we learn, how we teach, how we lead. And it is not a check-the-box approach. It is not a packaged program. It is reframing the conversation from social emotional learning to learning is social and emotional. Anyone who's been in the classroom, who's been in a school building knows that you cannot learn or teach without social and emotional being part of that. Also, it's important for us to consider as Colin was sharing, moving from a deficit-based model to thinking of assets, not only assets of our students, but beyond the assets of the communities and the families. Another piece of that is welcoming the families and having culturally sustaining practices part of this work. Let's see what else I have here. SEL also is the place to allow adults and young people to come into a place and to lead with their authentic selves. We talk about people having to check themselves and leave themselves and their identities at the door. And the importance of all stakeholders, especially young people, being part of the co-creation of the world, having the agency and critical consciousness to engage in participatory democracy, to have the voice and the choice. And really, as we think about SEL and equity, SEL essentially being in the service of liberation. And so that's where I will end thinking about SEL in the service of liberation, moving beyond equity to liberation, and then challenging you all to consider to take that back and to do the work.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you for giving us so much to think about. And we, I think, are going to move to dinner, but then there will be plenty of opportunity for folks to keep talking and ask questions in small groups as we meet after dinner.
Thank you to our distinguished panel. Hope everyone feels like we have a new mandate. We're going to pause. Please feel free to grab dinner and come back to your seat. Gretchen, can you click over? We're going to take a break, and then one more. Thank you. So just so everyone knows, we're going to break out into 7 tables where we will continue the conversation that our panelists started with us and break out into groups based on sort of where you might be in your work. So we'll have a table with Dina on building a culturally responsive community, a table with Colin on district perspective, in doing this work, a table with Gretchen and Laura on school perspective in this work, Heron and Priscilla on classroom perspective, Dr. Jagers on out of school time, and we're going to add to this wonderful group of experts, given the number of folks in the room and the work that you do, 2 additional tables. One, Dr. Craig Bailey from Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, focusing on early childhood perspective for our early childhood providers in the room, and a table with Jennifer Miller, our expert family engagement representative. So please take a break, grab some food, and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. And thank you again to our distinguished panel. One more round of applause.